transcribe the text on that manuscript. So when we're talking about what is potentially our oldest evidence for the New Testament.
The Joe Rogan Experience has often delved into the history of early Christianity.
So you were talking about, like, what is our oldest manuscript evidence? So this guy is P52. John Ryland's 457.
Especially early documented evidence. And now the internet has erupted once again with claims that scientists have found a 2,000-year-old letter from Jesus. So, what do Joe Rogan and his guests have to say about all of this?
Yeah, he's writing with a lot of emotion, and he has no idea 2,000 years later anyone would be reading these letters.
And what about mainstream academics? Today, we'll go through several such ancient texts and try to dissect the reality. The Hamburg fragment. In 2024, a team of scholars from the University of Hamburg and the Hamburg State and University Library announced the re-identification of a small, overlooked papyrus fragment
in Greek on a papyrus fragment. This is an original. You can see it here at the Museum of the Bible.
That turned out to be part of the infancy Gospel of Thomas, one of the earliest known apocryphal accounts of Jesus' childhood. The fragment, catalogued within the library's papyrus collection for decades, had previously been dismissed as a mundane writing exercise due to its irregular lines, uneven script, and poor penmanship. However, advances in multispectral imaging and textual comparison tools allowed researchers to identify linguistic patterns and phrases corresponding precisely to known passages in the Greek infancy Gospel of Thomas. The finding not only added a new manuscript witness to a well-known non-canonical text, but also illustrated how early Christian communities continued to reinterpret the life of Jesus centuries after his death. The papyrus, now referred to informally as the Hamburg fragment, measures roughly 11 by 5 centimeters and contains 13 lines of Greek text written on a single side. Paleographic analysis dated the handwriting style to the 4th or 5th century CE, placing it several hundred years after Jesus' lifetime in early 1st century Judea. But wait, that's not the interesting part. Its modest size and informal script suggest that it was not a liturgical copy, likely a private or instructional one, possibly even a student's practice sheet. This would not have been unusual in late antiquity, when biblical and apocryphal texts were commonly copied in educational contexts. The fragment is a standard papyrus sheet prepared in the Egyptian style, which suggests that it was produced within the Eastern Mediterranean world, likely in Egypt or Syria, where apocryphal Gospels were widely circulated and preserved in monastic libraries. When the Hamburg's team compared its contents with known manuscripts of the infancy Gospel of Thomas, they found a striking correspondence with the section narrating the vivification of the sparrows. In this story, the child Jesus fashions 12 clay birds while playing near a stream on the Sabbath. When confronted by a bystander for violating the holy day, he claps his hands, and the clay figures come to life and fly away. The tale has long fascinated scholars for its symbolic implications, representing divine creativity, transgression, and innocence. But it was excluded from canonical scripture for precisely those reasons. The canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, make no mention of Jesus' childhood beyond his birth and a single episode at age 12. The infancy Gospel of Thomas itself is an apocryphal work probably composed in Greek between 150 and 185 CE, likely in Syria or Asia Minor. Its authorship is anonymous, though ancient tradition attributed it to the Apostle Thomas. Over the centuries, the text was translated into Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Georgian, and Ethiopic. Yet church leaders from Irenaeus in the 2nd century to Pope Gelasius in the 5th century condemned it as heretical or at least unreliable. By the Middle Ages, the text survived mostly in monasteries at the fringes of Christendom, and its influence lingered in folk retellings of Jesus' boyhood miracles. The Hamburg fragment, therefore, represents one of the earliest surviving material witnesses to this literary tradition. Its discovery complements other fragments of the infancy Gospel of Thomas, housed in collections in Vienna, Paris, and Oxford. Collectively, these manuscripts allow historians to reconstruct the evolution of the text.
So here we are in the John Rylands Library in the University of Manchester, and I want to show you this most extraordinary manuscript.
Over time, and to understand how apocryphal Gospels were used for devotion, teaching, or storytelling, rather than as sources of doctrinal authority. The Hamburg fragment's linguistic features, such as the use of the definite article before the divine name and certain grammatical constructions typical of 4th century Koine Greek, also help refine the chronology of the text's transmission. While some media outlets initially framed the 2024 discovery as evidence of a lost gospel or even a letter from Jesus, scholars quickly emphasized that the papyrus is not a direct communication from Jesus or his disciples. Rather, it reflects the creative storytelling of later Christian writers who sought to express theological ideas through imaginative narrative. In this case, the story of the sparrows embodies themes of compassion, divine power, and the blurred line between play and miracle. The fact that such a story survived in fragmentary form more than 1,500 years later reflects the diversity of early Christian thought and the endurance of popular piety beyond ecclesiastical boundaries. Radiocarbon dating and spectral analysis of the ink, conducted at the Center for the Study of Manuscript Cultures in Hamburg, confirmed the estimated 4th to 5th century range. The results aligned with the style of uncial handwriting prevalent in Egypt and Syria during that period, and the chemical composition of the carbon-based ink matched other manuscripts from the same region. While the fragment itself may not say much in text, it does point to a broader reality. Texts attributed to Jesus Christ. Historians and scholars of religion broadly agree that Jesus of Nazareth was a historical figure, a Jewish preacher active in Roman Judea during the 1st century AD, early 1st century CE, most likely between 28 and 30 CE. This consensus is supported not only by Christian sources, but also by references in Jewish and Roman texts. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing around 93 CE in his Antiquities of the Jews, mentions Jesus, who was called Christ, and his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, between 26 and 36 CE. The Roman senator and historian Tacitus, writing about 115 CE in his Annals, refers to Christus, who suffered execution during Tiberius's reign. His teachings were transmitted orally, consistent with the oral culture of 1st century Palestine, where literacy rates are estimated by historians such as Catherine Hezer to have been below 10% among the Jewish population. Thus, memory, repetition, and communal storytelling served as the main means of preserving teachings. The canonical Gospels were composed decades later, between approximately 70 and 100 CE in Greek, rather than the Aramaic Jesus spoke. These writings were shaped by oral traditions circulating after Jesus' death, interpreted in light of subsequent experiences, particularly the belief in his resurrection. The earliest written Christian materials are not the Gospels, but the letters of Paul the Apostle, dated to between 49 and 62 CE, about 2 decades after Jesus' crucifixion. Paul's epistles, such as those to the Corinthians and Galatians, contain early summaries of Jesus' teachings and passion, but focus primarily on theology rather than biography. From these sources onward, Jesus' words and actions were preserved through layers of translation, retelling, and textual copying. However, later Christian traditions claimed to preserve writings directly from Jesus. The most famous of these are the letters of Jesus to King Abgar of Edessa. The account originates in the 4th century CE, when Eusebius of Caesarea, often regarded as the father of church history, included the correspondence in his monumental Ecclesiastical History. Writing around 325 CE under the reign of Constantine the Great, Eusebius claimed to have found the letters in the archives of Edessa, a city located in what is now Şanlıurfa, southeastern Turkey. then part of the Roman province of Osroene. According to his narrative, King Abgar V, who reigned from roughly 4 BCE to 50 CE, suffered from a debilitating illness, often described as leprosy in later retellings, and had heard of Jesus' miraculous healing powers spreading across Judea. From his royal seat in Edessa, a strategic city on the trade routes between the Roman and Parthian empires, Abgar sent a letter to Jesus through an envoy named Ananias or Hanan. The letter implored Jesus to visit Edessa, both to heal the king and to offer sanctuary from the hostility he faced in Jerusalem. In Eusebius's version, Jesus is said to have written a reply. In the response, Jesus commended Abgar for his faith and acknowledged his affliction, but gently declined the invitation, explaining that his mission required him to remain in Judea. He promised, however, that after his ascension, he would send one of his disciples to heal Abgar and bring the message of salvation to his people. Eusebius wrote that these letters, both Abgar's appeal and Jesus' reply, were preserved in the royal archives of Edessa, and that he had personally translated them from Syriac into Greek. Later traditions expanded upon this story, weaving it into the Christian heritage of Mesopotamia. The doctrine of Addai, a Syriac text from the late 4th or early 5th century, elaborated on Eusebius's account, identifying the disciple sent by Jesus as Thaddeus of Edessa, also known as Addai, one of the 70 disciples mentioned in Luke 10. Addai, according to the text, healed Abgar of his illness and converted him and much of the city to Christianity, making Edessa one of the first urban centers to adopt the new faith. This story was profoundly influential in Syriac Christianity, where Edessa was revered as the Blessed City and became a hub of early Christian learning and translation. During the Middle Ages, several copies surfaced, some preserved in Byzantine monasteries or Armenian manuscripts, often adorned with royal seals or ornate script to bolster their authenticity. Western Europe encountered the story through Latin translations by writers such as Cedrenus and Nicephorus Callistus, who repeated it as historical fact. In Islamic tradition, Abgar sometimes appears as a righteous ruler who acknowledged Jesus as a prophet. To this day, the Abgar letters retain enduring symbolic power. They illustrate how communities sought tangible contact with the divine through written words. But wait, that's not all. Discussions on the Joe Rogan Experience. Among the many subjects that Joe Rogan and his guests have explored, early Christianity and the historicity of Jesus have surfaced repeatedly. One of the most notable recent discussions in this vein occurred on episode number 2252, when Rogan hosted Wesley Huff, a Canadian Christian apologist and historian known for his research on biblical manuscripts and early Christian transmission. The episode was recorded at Rogan's studio in Austin, Texas, and ran over 3 hours. During the conversation, Huff detailed the physical and historical evidence for early New Testament documents, focusing particularly on Papyrus 52, one of the oldest surviving fragments of the Gospel of John. Measuring only about 8.9 by 6 centimeters, the papyrus contains verses from John 18:31 to 33 and 37 to 38, written in Greek. It was discovered in Egypt during the early 20th century and is now preserved in the John Rylands Library at the University of Manchester, United Kingdom. Radiocarbon and paleographic analyses have dated it to approximately 125 to 150 CE, less than a century after the events it describes. Huff emphasized that this fragment's survival offers tangible evidence of the early circulation of the Gospel of John. Christian manuscript copying was thus happening even within the Roman Empire's first 2 centuries. Rogan expressed surprise that such a small, delicate piece of papyrus could provide so much historical insight, noting that Christianity's textual foundation appeared to be more firmly evidenced than he had assumed. He compared the early dating of Papyrus 52 to the manuscript timelines of other classical works, such as Homer's Iliad, or the writings of Plato, where the earliest surviving copies are often separated from the originals by a gap of 800 to 1,200 years. The comparison led to a broader conversation about how the New Testament's documentary record, represented by over 5,800 known Greek manuscripts, alongside thousands of Latin and Coptic copies, constitutes one of the most well-preserved textual traditions of the ancient world. Huff pointed out that, while scribal variations exist, the core message of the texts remains remarkably stable across centuries. Rogan treated early Christian history as a case study in how ideas evolve, survive, and gain authority. Huff contextualized these developments within the broader Roman world, citing discoveries such as the Rylands papyri, the Chester Beatty collections, and the Bodmer papyri, which together demonstrate the widespread textual transmission of Christian writings by the late 2nd century CE. But what about the letters from Jesus? Well, let's unveil the truth, the reality of the letters from Jesus. Modern scholars classify the letters of Jesus to King Abgar of Edessa as pseudepigraphical because their content, language, and historical context make it clear they could not have originated in the early 1st century CE, nor from Jesus himself. To begin with, everything known about the correspondence comes from a single secondary source, Eusebius of Caesarea's Ecclesiastical History, written around 325 CE, more than 2.5 centuries after Jesus and Abgar would have lived. Eusebius reports that he discovered the exchange in the Archives of Edessa, written in Syriac, and translated it into Greek for his readers. Yet, he provides no physical description of the documents, no information about their material form, and no corroborating evidence from contemporary records. No other historian before him, including early Christian writers like Tertullian, Origen, or Irenaeus, ever mentions these letters. Their sudden appearance in the 4th century, precisely when Edessa was emerging as an influential Christian center, strongly suggests they were composed locally to support theological and civic prestige, rather than preserved from antiquity. The text of the letters themselves betrays a later origin through linguistic and stylistic analysis. The original language, Syriac, was the dominant dialect of Edessa in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, long after Jesus' lifetime, when Aramaic and Greek were used in Judea. The syntax and vocabulary of the Abgar correspondence match the rhetorical conventions of post-Nicene Syriac Christian literature, not the simpler Semitic idioms of early 1st century Galilee. Scholars such as Sebastian Brock and William Curitin have pointed out that the grammar and theological phrasing, especially the description of Jesus' ascension to heaven and the promise to send a disciple afterward, reflect a fully developed Christian theology, one that presupposes the resurrection narrative and Trinitarian understanding that only crystallized by the 3rd or 4th century. The letters could not have been written before the events they describe had been codified into doctrine. The absence of Greek or Aramaic originals further undermines any claim of authenticity. Eusebius mentions translating the letters from Syriac, but offers no evidence that earlier versions existed. All extant manuscripts of the correspondence, including those found in later compilations like the Doctrine of Addai, date from centuries after his account, and are preserved only in Syriac or derivative Armenian and Arabic translations. Textual critics have compared multiple versions and found notable textual divergence, suggesting that the story evolved through retelling and theological embellishment, rather than preservation of a single authentic document. This process mirrors what Bart D. Ehrman, in Forgery and Counterforgery, calls pious pseudepigraphy, as in the writing of devotional texts in the name of revered figures to lend authority to local traditions. From a historical standpoint, the political and religious context of Edessa provides strong motivation for such a composition. By the early 4th century, Edessa was a thriving hub of Syriac Christianity, home to scholars, translators, and ascetics who produced a rich body of theological writing. claiming that their city had received a personal letter from Jesus himself, elevated Edessa's status within the Christian world, aligning with its self-image as the first Christian kingdom. This narrative also paralleled Edessa's legend of the image of Edessa, or Mandylion. Another story claiming a miraculous portrait of Jesus was sent to Abgar. Both legends served to establish Edessa as a divinely favored city and to authenticate its lineage of faith, especially as Christianity spread eastward into Mesopotamia and Persia. Textually and thematically, the Abgar correspondence shares features with other pseudepigraphical writings of late antiquity. Between the 2nd and 5th centuries CE, it was common for Christian authors to compose letters, gospels, or apocalypses under the names of apostles or even Jesus himself. These works include the Gospel of Peter, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Apocalypse of Peter, and the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Like the Abgar letters, they sought to fill perceived narrative gaps left by the canonical Gospels, or to expand on theological ideas in a more accessible form. Scholars such as François Bouvin and Tony Burke categorize such works not as deliberate hoaxes, but as creative theological literature, expressions of faith through imaginative storytelling. The prevalence of pseudepigraphy in early Christianity reflects the fluid boundaries of scriptural authority before the establishment of the New Testament canon. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, no fixed list of authoritative books existed. Regional communities preserved and circulated different texts that expressed local beliefs and practices. Councils such as Hippo in 393 CE and Carthage in 397 CE eventually confirmed the 27-book canon recognized today, but apocryphal writings like the Abgar letters continued to flourish in Syriac, Coptic, and Ethiopic Christianity. Manuscript finds from Egyptian monasteries, Syriac collections, and Ethiopian archives show that these texts remained integral to local devotional life for centuries, even as they were excluded from official orthodoxy. In any case, the endurance of Jesus' historical and cultural presence, even amid the likes of the Abgar correspondence or modern internet fabrications, is highlighted by the survival of genuine early manuscripts such as the Hamburg fragment and papyrus 52. These artifacts, though small and fragmentary, represent tangible links to the earliest centuries of Christianity and the communities that transmitted its message. The Hamburg papyrus reflects how believers sought to imagine Jesus' childhood in narratives outside the canonical Gospels. Papyrus 52, held in the John Rylands Library and dated around 125 to 150 EC, preserves verses from the Gospel of John and stands as the oldest known piece of the New Testament. Together, they demonstrate that while apocryphal inventions and pseudepigraphical stories have long circulated, the historical inquiry into Jesus rests on real, datable, and verifiable evidence. The persistence of fascination with Jesus reveals not only the spiritual magnetism of his figure, but also the enduring scholarly commitment to separating historical truth from devotional imagination, ensuring that the man from 1st century Judea remains one of the most documented and debated individuals in human history. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.